John, thanks for being here. Yeah, everything I've learned about zoonotic transfer, I learned from Dennis Carroll and Andrew Natsios when I went to those pandemic Woodstocks that Andrew has been convening at Texas A&M. Prophetically for the last 5 years. So John, thanks for being here. If I said to you, could you explain to Earth people what is zoonotic transfer and why does that matter to this conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. It's a real pleasure to be part of this panel, and really great to hear the contributions and insights from Maureen and Dennis. And I think that the points and takeaways have thus far been excellent, and I think they'll complement well with what I'll raise in response to your questions. I also think I'll probably take a little bit of a different focus and perspective. And so in terms of zoonotic diseases, I think as you think about the emergence and spread, it's important to talk a little bit about some of the underlying and deep-seated drivers of zoonotic diseases. And in this case, of course, the focus of the discussion is COVID-19. And I think to do so, we need to think about the linkages between environmental degradation and human health, and how in turn, that has influenced in many ways the emergence of this pandemic and puts us at, in my opinion, continued risk for emerging infectious disease events more broadly. And so, related to that, I think when we just discuss COVID, we rightfully so look at the issues principally through a public health perspective and also a response lens. And both of these are, of course, critically important and urgent. But I think in terms of zoonotics and emerging pandemics, to fundamentally think about long-term solutions and make sure, to your point, Dan, that this doesn't happen again. It's really important to analyze and understand what created the conditions for the pandemic in the first place. So, if you consider drivers, I think the critical point here, and I can explain this further, is that ecosystem degradation and habitat loss driven by population growth, urbanization, shifting dietary patterns have really made us vulnerable to an increasing rate and frequency of emerging zoonotic viruses, and as a result, COVID. And so, we know from COVID that the emergence and spread of these diseases, and these are events where viruses are transmitted from wildlife or animals to humans. These, of course, have devastating and far-reaching impacts as our world has become increasingly globalized and interconnected. And of course, they're often highly lethal. I think to sort of describe that point a little bit further, and so everyone's sort of clear of these linkages, we know, of course, that the demands on natural resources are increasing. Populations and population density continue to grow. Food, fiber, and energy demand in turn is of course rapidly increasing. We know that the projections of the need to nearly double food production by 2050 to feed over 9 billion people, and of course the related demand on land and water resources and ecosystem goods and services. And so as all of this plays out, what's happening is that land and ecosystems that had previously served as habitats for wildlife populations are now increasingly used for agriculture and livestock production, or to accommodate growing human settlements and urban and peri-urban expansion. And so this issue of demographic change and growing pressure on habitats and biodiversity, it really creates conditions for wildlife that may serve as a host or reservoir of zoonotic pathogens to increasingly come into contact with other animals or people. And so, as habitats are fragmented, there are fewer places for wildlife to live and fewer food sources. So animals are finding food and shelter where people are now living. And so, for example, we know that bat populations, which of course present significant risks as hosts of zoonotic viruses, they've increasingly set up in areas that are in closer proximity to human settlements. And that's just one example of greater human-wildlife interactions due to land use change and habitat loss. And all of this, of course, increases the risk of disease spread and what is known as spillover when viruses jump from animals to humans. And just a couple more points, Dan, and then of course we can go to some other questions. I want to bring up the issue of wildlife trade. I mean, this is something that I think has been on, all of our radars, and increasingly so with COVID, and it's another manifestation of environmental events that are increasing risk of animal to human disease transmission. This is due to the conditions it creates of close contact between wildlife and humans, cross-border movement of species without, in many cases, appropriate biosafety protocols or inspections. In the case of illegal trade, it's often in poor transport conditions and outside regulated markets. And we've seen the scope and volume of wildlife trade grow and become increasingly interconnected and sophisticated with globalization. And of course, this presents even greater human health risks. And there's been a lot of focus on this issue in the context of COVID and whether the virus jumped from an animal host to humans and
Probably.
and wet markets.
So John, if I use the term One Health, what is One Health? Because that's a thing in your world, right? What is One Health, John?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important, point, and One Health is essentially recognizing that human, animal, and ecosystem health are all interdependent. I mean, that's, I'd say, the fundamental tenet of the One Health concept. And, again, One Health is something that has been on the agenda and recognized as a priority for quite some time. And now, of course, has been really, I'd say, reinvigorated due to the COVID situation. But it has to be, prioritized. We need to continue.
Okay, so John, are you up for sitting in a basement again in 5 years' time for 18 months? I'm like not up.
I hope not. I hope not.
You're not up for that either, right?
Yes.
Okay. So if no one's, I'm going to ask, we could have a little survey. Is anyone up for doing this 5 years from now for the next funny name disease and sit in our basements and Zoom at each other for 18 months while we wait till we find another vaccine? If we don't want to do this again, and I'm up for not doing this again, then we got to deal with this One Health stuff. All this stuff, zoonotic diseases means if we don't deal with zoonotic diseases, we're sitting in our basements again in 5 years' time. That's what this means. That's why we had John on this conversation. Okay, so John, there's a thing called a wet market. What's a wet market, and are wet markets a good thing or a bad thing? Should we outlaw wet markets? And why am I raising that in this discussion?
Well, you're raising it because, of course, the discussion of the sort of spillover from in the context of COVID from animals to humans, the location where this was identified as Wuhan, and discussion about wet markets as sort of the source. I mean, I think the response to that is a bit more nuanced. I mean, wet markets are essentially live, animal markets. Also, there can be sale of all kinds of goods and services, and inherently they don't necessarily present issues, but they present risks. And I think, as it goes to wet markets and the issue of wildlife trade, it's not as simple as banning wildlife trade. I mean, there's a whole set of unintended consequences that I think present themselves as a result of that. So I think that we need to focus on regulations and enforcement and
that's something AID could do, right, John? I mean, this is something. Yep. This is right up AID's alley. So One Health, managing ecosystems, supporting, managing forests, planning, urban planning, super non-glamorous stuff, but really important stuff to make sure that you have development, or the kinds of things you're describing, like regulating wet markets or going after and dealing with issues around illegal animal trade. These are all things where there's an undergird of stuff that AID and AID's ecosystem of partners do to respond to that challenge. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So, okay, so you're not anti-wet markets in the sense that we shouldn't outlaw wet markets, but we need to sure as hell throw a lot of we need to regulate the hell out of them so we don't have this again?
That's, yeah, I mean, you know, the regulations and enforcement piece is really fundamental in terms of
So
wildlife
just
trade
so
issues.
everyone understands, I think everyone in our viewing audience knows this, but the ostensible thing that happened was there's either one or two, several things happen. Either a young person at the weapons lab didn't wash their hands properly for 25 seconds after they left the weapons lab in Wuhan. Or, you know, this is the various theories. Another one is that there was somebody had an infected animal at the wet market, and we can have different discussions about how that infected animal showed up at the wet market, but somehow there was a zoonotic transfer from a diseased animal at the wet market and got somebody in Wuhan, and that person then spread it, right? Isn't that in essence, though? I mean, I'm not going to ask you to comment on all the theories, but the reason we're having this conversation about zoonotic transfer and we're having a conversation about wet markets is because the ostensible theory about what happened is something like that happened. And so now, so when we talk about things like peri-urban stuff or changes in human diet or wet markets, it all has to do with the fact that the reason that all comes up, then we ask ourselves, why are we sitting in our basements zooming at each other, is because of that. Is that right?
That's right, Dan.
Yeah. So I'm not up for doing this again in 5 years. So it seems to me that what John is saying is something we really need to get a handle on, because we have to get ahead of this in the future. We need to think in security terms about environmental security as a form of national security. And that we need to think about environmental health when we think about global health, right? These are the kinds of concepts that you're trying to tell us. Is that right, John?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you know, again, getting back to the One Health as an important priority, you know, it's really critical that we no longer treat environmental issues and environmental programming as separate from health.
Separate from everything else.
Programming.
We need to incorporate environmental security into national security. You're seeing this in the ocean space because of great power competition. You're seeing this in what's called IUU fishing. Guess what? We now need to look at this issue of One Health as part of a national security thing, because I like you, John, but I don't want to zoom at you again in my basement 5 years. When we reconvene 5 years from now, I don't want to do this again with you. I wanted to do this at CSIS. We're all like normal times. And I want, you guys are all welcome. We'll all sit on a panel and I'll shake your hand, and, you know, and we can fight over the coffee bar and not be freaked out and feel like we're going to get a disease or something. I don't like this sitting in my basement. So I'm not up for this again. Okay. It's ridiculous. So what John is saying, we got to deal with. This is really, really important. It's not a sidebar nice to have. This is an existential set of issues that John's putting on the table.